this is an ethnic genocide being perpetrated by a specific ethno-religious group which has, well, let me not say it elements within a specific ethno-religious group who have designs on artificially replacing entire population across the middle belt of Nigeria. Those populations generally tend to be either African traditional religious worshippers or Christians. They are being systematically replaced, right? The video you played at the start with the gentleman recounting what was done to his village, this is a pattern that has persisted for years, coming into decades now, where the point isn't necessarily to murder everyone living in the middle belt. That's not the point of it. If you recall, he mentioned that they burnt all their crops, everything that can help them to survive was destroyed. Now, if this was all about just killing people, why would these bandits, terrorists, killers, whatever you call them, why would they go after crops and burn them for no reason? The reason is that the purpose of these attacks is to render those places completely uninhabitable and inhospitable to the indigent populations so that they will leave. And when they do leave, as has happened hundreds of times, when they do leave, then these settlers, as you call them, the Fulani settlers, then move in, actually rename these villages, right? So someone somewhere was known as, it belonged to an indigenous group, maybe a TV or a Famswang group maybe in Plateau State or in Southern Kaduna or whatever. And then these attacks happen and these people are forced to leave because even if they survive the attacks, there is no way for them to continue living in that place. Their houses have been destroyed, their farmland have been destroyed, their livestock has been destroyed. They have no way of surviving, so they have to leave. And when they leave, those villages are then occupied. The indigenous names of those villages are changed to Muslim or Fulani names. And then before you then have an artificial settler population settling in those places, building houses and themselves the occupiers of that place. So that later on, when the original indigenous populations start to come back, then there's this whole thing going on about actually we are the owners of the land, and then the people who are then there will say no, you just here. There's a whole thing, and then the government gets involved, and the government will then say, okay, two of you have to find a way to survive together, and then this one will say, okay, we want our own traditional leader, and then before you know it, a place that was completely indigenous before and Christian or ATR, before you know it starts having population years, right? That is expansionism. That's how it works, right? It's a form of imperialism. Let's call it what it is. It is a directed and targeted campaign of ethnic genocide. That is exactly what is happening. This is documented. And by the way, the US government agrees with this assessment. There's a whole report about this. If you also recall, there was a documentary done by a journalist from Southern Kaduna. I believe his name is Bivan Magoni. This documentary was published at the tail end of 2022 on the West Africa Weekly YouTube documentary channel. It's called Southern Kaduna Blood, Tears, Anger. Whoever hasn't watched it should Google that name, Southern Kaduna Blood, Tears, Anger, and watch that documentary. All of this was documented in very great detail. This exact process I've described, how these villagers are attacked with this big goal of driving them out. The goal is not necessarily to kill everyone, but the goal is to inflict so much economic devastation and so much emotional trauma that people can no longer feasibly live in those places. The people who were there can no longer feasibly live in those places. They are forced to leave IDP camps or move to the state capital or whatever, or move down to Lagos. And then the first wave of attackers is then replaced by the next wave of settlers from the same ethnic group. And then before you know it, the name of the village is changed. And this has happened over 100 times. And that's just in Southern Kaduna alone. That's not counting the entire Middle Belt. That's just Southern Kaduna alone. So that's just to give you an idea of what is happening here. What we are witnessing is something very similar to what was done in Sudan. Sudan is a fairly recent example of how this works. So if you recall, in the 90s, going up onto the late noughties, similar thing going on in the area now known as and the place which is now known as South Sudan. There was a whole thing just like this going on where the Arab in Khartoum, led by Omar al-Bashir, was using sort of state-backed militias. They were unofficial, but they were state-backed militias to artificially displace populations of Black Africans who were either Christian or African traditional religious practitioners, who were then being systematically and artificially replaced by Arab, Berber, and Tuareg Muslims, who were, more, preferable populations to those ones. And this was recognized as an ethnic genocide. It's part of the reason why the US appointed a special